lied to her about those number of things?
Because I wanted her to keep talking about the offenses so I would be cleared.
In the shadowy world of death row, some inmates leave behind last wishes that are as bizarre as their crimes. From twisted final meals to haunting final statements, these requests open a window into minds shaped by violence, regret, or defiance. Let's step inside prison walls to discover the most disturbing last wishes from 7 condemned killers. Patrick Brian Knight was a Texas inmate whose reputation spread beyond the barbed wire fences where he awaited execution. Born in 1968, Knight's early years were not particularly notable. He grew up in Amarillo, Texas, bounced between a few jobs, and had no major run-ins with the law until he crossed a line that led him straight to death row. His life changed irreversibly in August 1991 when, alongside his accomplice Robert Bradfield, he committed a crime that would shock the local community. Walter and Marianne Werner were a middle-aged couple leading quiet lives. On August 27, 1991, Knight and Bradfield abducted them from their home. The brutality was swift and cold. Investigators later learned Knight returned to his trailer as though nothing had happened, while Bradfield attempted to cover their tracks. Despite these efforts, detectives pieced the crime together. Knight was soon arrested, tried, and ultimately sentenced to death. In prison, Knight's case garnered attention for one key reason: his dark sense of humor. Fellow inmates spoke of Knight as a man who used wry jokes to mask his fear. Guards noticed that whenever the subject of execution came up, Knight might crack a bizarre one-liner or shrug as though it were someone else's problem. The man had an unsettling calm, which some interpreted as chilling indifference to murder. Over the years, Knight filed appeals challenging the fairness of his trial. Each denial brought him closer to the execution chamber. Journalists noted his peculiar way of granting interviews. He refused to express remorse, often pivoting to commentary about the justice system. Victims' families perceived this as arrogance, while Knight's supporters saw it as someone resigned to his fate. As his last day approached, rumors swirled around what final request he might make. Many inmates asked for comforting foods or a meaningful item from their childhood, but Knight seemed more interested in how people would react than in personal indulgences. He also joked, some say threatened, that his final statement would be a surprise. When the prison warden asked Knight about his final meal, he reportedly chose something entirely ordinary, if he chose anything at all. But the real shock came with his final statement. On the night of his execution, Knight stood strapped to the gurney and looked around the witness chamber. Media representatives, the victim's family, and prison officials all watched in hushed tension. Knight began by thanking his own family, but then added, "I said I was going to tell a joke. Death has set me free. That's the biggest joke." Those chilling words drew a collective gasp in the chamber. He went further, claiming, "I am not Patrick Brian Knight, and y'all can't stop this execution now." Some believed that he was referring to a personal identity crisis or mental break, while others interpreted it as dark, mocking humor. William George Bonin earned the nickname the Freeway Killer for a string of murders across Southern California between 1979 and 1980, targeting young male hitchhikers and runaways. He kidnapped, raped, and tortured them before discarding their bodies near highway exits. By the time authorities tracked him down, at least 21 young men and boys were dead. Bonin's chilling brutality stunned law enforcement, who discovered torture methods that spoke to a deeply sadistic nature. At trial, Bonin showed little emotion. Witnesses recounted horrifying details, from strangulations to the use of objects like metal bars in his assaults. Juries convicted him on multiple counts, and the judge handed him a death sentence. Bonin was placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he waited through years of appeals. Guards described Bonin as oddly polite in everyday matters, often absent of moral reflection. Psychologists who examined him suggested he exhibited psychopathic traits, meaning he lacked empathy and had no real sense of guilt. The families of his many victims hoped that his final day on earth would bring an end to their nightmares. Life on death row offered Bonin little chance for redemption. He rarely engaged in self-improvement programs or outreach. Some fellow inmates loathed him for his crimes against minors. Bonin managed to keep a low profile, possibly because many on death row had equally heinous records. He spent much of his time in isolation. Over years of appeals, attorneys argued about procedural errors, but the courts largely stood by the conviction. As Bonin's final date drew closer, The true crime community paid attention, clamoring for any detail on his mental state. Journalists requested interviews, but he gave only a few. In them, Bonin almost seemed detached from the scope of his actions, never once offering a genuine apology. Meanwhile, families of victims grew anxious to witness the execution. They hoped to see him show even a shred of remorse. When officials inquired about Bonin's final meal request, he made a choice that some found disturbing in its cavalier indulgence. He asked for 2 large pepperoni pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and multiple 6-packs of soda. Observers noted how the meal's extravagance seemed at odds with the sorrow he had inflicted. It came across as one final act of selfish pleasure. No spiritual reflection, no mention of atonement. In the final hours, prison staff delivered the meal to his cell. Other inmates whispered that Bonin devoured it with calm satisfaction. Victims' families viewed it as a grotesque final insult. News outlets that followed the story questioned what such a feast revealed about his psyche. Psychologists suggested it indicated a lack of remorse and an obsessive attachment to sensory gratification, even in his last moments. On the day of his execution, February 23, 1996, Bonin was moved to the death chamber at San Quentin. Witnesses included both reporters and some victim relatives, each hoping to see if he'd offer a final statement. With lethal injection equipment prepped, Bonin spoke only a few words, none of them apologetic. According to eyewitnesses, he essentially blamed uncontrollable urges for his actions. Aileen Carol Wuornos is often remembered as one of the few high-profile female serial killers. Born in 1956, she faced a life of relentless abuse and hardship. By her teens, Wuornos was working as a sex worker along Florida highways. Between 1989 and 1990, she killed 7 men she encountered while soliciting. Although she claimed self-defense, alleging these men either raped or attempted to rape her, investigators soon pegged her as a serial offender. When Wuornos was brought to trial, media attention exploded. Cameras captured every glare and outburst she directed at the judge, lawyers, and onlookers. She accused the police of corruption, declared that voices told her to kill, and repeatedly insisted she was protecting herself from sexual assaults. Despite these claims, the courts found her guilty, and she received multiple death sentences. Journalists latched onto her case as a rare glimpse into female-perpetrated violence. Books, documentaries, and even a Hollywood film followed. Wuornos herself seemed torn between defiance and desperation. In interviews, she vacillated between blaming society for her upbringing and acknowledging she took lives. Locked away on Florida's death row, Wuornos experienced isolation that seemed to worsen her mental health. Her paranoia spiraled, and she believed her food was being tainted. Guards and inmates alike viewed her with caution. Some saw her as a violent enigma, others as a tragic figure shaped by early trauma. She gave few visitors access to her thoughts, aside from sporadic interviews that revealed a growing disconnection from reality. As appeals run their course, Wuornos's erratic behavior baffled observers. She asked for her execution to be hurried, stating she believed the prison was torturing her psychologically. Experts questioned her sanity, but the court ultimately deemed her competent. The date for her lethal injection loomed. Many wondered what last meal or final request she would make. Most condemned individuals select something symbolic or comforting, favorite homemade dishes, or nostalgic treats from childhood. But Wuornos was never predictable. Wuornos declined a specific final meal request, opting instead for just a cup of coffee. Witnesses, however, recall her final words as some of the most bizarre in the annals of American executions. Standing strapped to the gurney on October 9th, 2002, she declared, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with The Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Her statement referenced everything from religion to science fiction pop culture. It puzzled the prison officials, left reporters speechless, and sent a chill down the spines of victim families who came to witness her end. Some interpreted her words as a symbol of her desire for rebirth. Others felt it was the final unraveling of a deeply troubled mind. With that, the lethal injection took effect. Wuornos's eyes fluttered closed, and she slipped away. The official pronouncement confirmed the end of one of the country's most notorious female killers. The families of her victims had mixed reactions. A few felt relief, others mourned their loved ones in private, and some remained haunted by Wuornos's claims of self-defense. Jeffrey David Matthews entered the annals of notorious death row inmates for the murder of his relative. Born in 1972, Matthews struggled with minor offenses during his teenage years, but it was the 1994 murder of his great-uncle Otis Earl Short that landed him on Oklahoma's death row. Alongside an accomplice, Tracy Dyer, Matthews planned to rob Otis for money and firearms. The robbery escalated into violence. Otis was shot in the head and his wife's throat was slashed. Though the wife survived initially, she passed away later from unrelated causes, never fully recovering from the trauma. Meanwhile, evidence, including the murder weapon buried near Matthews' property, firmly tied him to the crime. A jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to death. Like many on death row, Matthews maintained his innocence for years, claiming his accomplice was the real culprit. But transcripts from the trial, along with physical proof, painted a different picture. Within the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Matthews gained a reputation for being calm and even friendly on the surface. Guards described him as polite, yet those close to him remarked on a persistent undertone of cunning. He filed numerous appeals, each bringing fresh media coverage that intrigued the public. While some inmates cling to spirituality or activism, Matthews took a measured approach, focusing on the appeals process. In interviews, he blamed the justice system for mistakes, pointing to inconsistencies in witness testimonies. He also hinted at prison life's brutality, mentioning he rarely ventured from his cell due to threats. Still, Matthews displayed occasional bursts of gallows humor. On the prison yard, he'd sometimes joke about the last meal tradition or about how the phone might ring just before his scheduled time. Fellow inmates noted that this humor often unnerved them. It was as though Matthews teetered between fear of death and resignation to it. Several times, Matthews received stays of execution due to issues like lethal injection controversies or new evidence claims. His supporters became convinced these delays signaled possible exoneration. However, courts repeatedly upheld the verdict. Each legal reprieve ended on another scheduled date with the executioner. As these dates mounted, speculation rose about what final wish Matthews might choose. Some guessed he would make a statement proclaiming innocence. Others suspected he'd want a comforting meal. But the only thing certain was that the state intended to see the sentence through eventually. On January 11th, 2011, Jeffrey David Matthews met his final hours. According to prison records, he asked for his last meal, a colossal feast including multiple cheeseburgers, a large side of fries, and various sweets. Even more bizarrely, some accounts claim he requested a special sauce or seasoning that the prison kitchen struggled to provide. While an opulent final meal isn't unheard of, the specificity of his demands, asking for certain brands of fast food, lent a disturbing flair. To some, it seemed like an attempt to control his fate in the only way left to him. Shortly before midnight, the warden asked if Matthews had anything else to add. Some witnesses say he joked, "If the governor calls, tell him I'm in the middle of dinner." That brand of sardonic humor followed him to the gurney. As the drugs were administered, Matthews thanked his supporters. Then, in a calm voice, he declared he held no animosity toward the victim's family, reiterating a final claim of innocence. Those in the witness room reported mixed emotions. The Short family had waited 17 years for this moment, hoping for peace. Thomas Douglas Arthur's life on Alabama's death row was marked by repeated convictions, overturned appeals, and a lingering claim of innocence that stirred widespread debate. He was convicted for the 1982 murder of Troy Wicker, purportedly a contract killing arranged by Wicker's wife Judy, who had an affair and a motive to collect insurance. Arthur steadfastly denied involvement, insisting Judy falsely accused him of saving herself. Multiple trials saw him convicted and then freed by technicalities, only to be convicted again. The last verdict stuck, and Alabama placed him on death row. Over the decades, Arthur became a poster child for protracted legal battles in capital cases, persisting well into his 70s. Arthur spent more than 30 years locked in a cell, cycling through appeals that tested the patience of the courts and the emotional stability of the victim's family. Some supporters believed newly discovered evidence might exonerate him. Others argued he was a master manipulator, leveraging every loophole. Courtroom footage shows an older man, frail yet sharp-tongued, refusing to concede guilt. Outside the prison gates, activists debated his guilt, Journalists wrote feature stories detailing the unusual longevity of his stay. The victims' relatives voiced frustration at a system seemingly unable to deliver an outcome. Through it all, Arthur never stopped proclaiming his innocence. As lethal injection replaced older execution methods, Arthur expressed concerns about the pain it might cause him. He had a serious back issue. The speculation over how an inmate's physical ailments affect execution was a hot-button issue. Some experts declared lethal injection was still humane. Others argued a man of Arthur's age might suffer more. Each time an execution date neared, Arthur's lawyers filed motions based on new evidence or untested DNA. In media interviews, he appeared calm, as though time behind bars had numbed him to fear. Yet tension lingered. The day would come when legal avenues ran out. In a final twist, Arthur made a public request to be executed by firing squad rather than lethal injection. Citing his back pain, he argued that lethal injection would be cruel and unusual for someone with his injuries. Observers saw it as either a genuine concern or a strategic delay tactic. Regardless, Alabama declined to deviate from its standard protocol. The idea of a modern-day firing squad sparked debate on talk shows. Some pointed out that a handful of U.S. states still listed firing squads as a backup. Others found it macabre and archaic. But if Arthur hoped this would buy him more time or ignite controversy that would lead to a reprieve, he was mistaken. On May 26, 2017, with all appeals exhausted, Arthur was taken to the death chamber. At 75, he was among the oldest inmates to face execution. Witnesses included members of Troy Wicker's family, journalists, and legal counsel. The hush in the chamber was broken by the mechanical hum of intravenous lines. Arthur gave a brief final statement, once again asserting he had nothing to do with Wicker's murder. Prison personnel administered the lethal drugs, and Arthur's breathing grew shallow. Within minutes, the official pronouncement ended his decades-long saga. For some, it was a relief that the courts had finally enforced the sentence. Others walked away still questioning the evidence. Fueling a final spark of controversy, Frank Jarvis Atwood found himself at the center of one of Arizona's most heartbreaking cases, the 1984 abduction and murder of 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson. She had gone to mail a birthday card and never returned. Law enforcement linked evidence, including witness accounts and forensic details, to Atwood, a man already on parole for a prior child-related crime. The horror of Vicki's fate devastated her family and struck fear into the local community. When her remains were found in the desert, the crime's cruelty propelled a swift trial. Atwood protested his innocence, but the jury believed the evidence. He was handed a death sentence that began a decades-long journey through the courts. Atwood used every appeal avenue possible, from challenging evidence to questioning the constitutionality of lethal injection. The drawn-out battle meant Vicki's family spent over 3 decades attending hearings, reading court documents, and wondering if they would ever see justice served. Meanwhile, Atwood resided in an isolated section of death row, occasionally drawing support from advocates who doubted the prosecution's case. During these years, multiple stories emerged about Atwood's back problems and claims that the prison environment worsened his health. He also adopted Greek Orthodox beliefs, finding solace in religious practice. Critics of the death penalty pointed out that no date should be set until all legitimate appeals are concluded. But for Vicki's family, the wait felt interminable. In 2022, after exhausting appeals, Atwood faced execution once again. By then, lethal injection protocols had come under fire. Amid drug shortages and claims of botched procedures, some inmates across the country were given choices like nitrogen gas or older methods. Atwood requested nitrogen gas, saying lethal injection would aggravate his chronic spinal issues. The state denied his request, maintaining lethal injection as the standard. This set the stage for a renewed debate in Arizona. Should the state accommodate requests for alternative methods if the inmate cites medical reasons? Was Atwood's plea genuine or a last attempt to delay? Meanwhile, the public remembered Vicki Lynn, the bright child whose life was stolen. Most felt the method was secondary to the fact that the crime demanded accountability. As the date neared, Atwood made a final request for a spiritual advisor, his Greek Orthodox priest, to accompany him in the chamber. He hoped to pray aloud and receive a last blessing. Officials approved this request, reflecting a national trend of recognizing inmates' religious freedom rights. He reportedly also asked for minimal movement during the execution to reduce pain in his spine, seeking a special gurney cushion. On June 8, 2022, the day arrived. Unlike some inmates who order large feasts, Atwood's final meal was unremarkable, something he rarely mentioned. Instead, his focus lay on the prayers and his comfort during the procedure. In his last recorded words, he expressed remorse for any suffering caused, though he still didn't explicitly admit guilt, leaving the family uncertain about his sincerity. Escorted to the chamber, Atwood's face appeared tense but resigned, according to witnesses. His priest stood near him, chanting prayers. As the lethal injection began, Atwood reportedly grimaced, possibly from pain, but within minutes fell silent. By official account, the process concluded swiftly. For Vicky's family, watching behind glass, a mixture of grief and relief took hold. The mother, Debbie Carlson, later stated that while nothing could bring back her daughter, seeing the execution brought a sense of finality. Victims' rights activists lauded the completion of an excruciating legal saga, while opponents of the death penalty cited it as another example of controversy-laden punishment. John Henry Ramirez was sentenced to death for the 2004 murder of Pablo Castro, a convenience store worker in Corpus Christi, Texas. The motive? A mere $1.25. Ramirez and his accomplices had been on a 3-day drug binge when they targeted Castro, who was taking out the trash. Ramirez stabbed him 29 times in a frenzied attack, leaving the victim to bleed out in the alley. Investigators caught up with Ramirez years later in Mexico, eventually extraditing him to face trial. Once imprisoned, Ramirez went through a transformation, at least on the surface. He claimed to have embraced Christianity, studying the Bible daily. Whether this was a genuine conversion or an attempt to lighten his sentence was a subject of debate. His legal team launched appeals centered on both procedural errors and spiritual grounds, asserting that Ramirez's faith journey merited reconsideration of his punishment. Still, the courts upheld his conviction and death sentence. Members of Pablo Castro's family attended every hearing, listening as Ramirez made vague apologies yet never fully accepted responsibility. He insisted something took over during the murder, painting himself as a man haunted by violent impulses but sincerely repentant. In a twist that captured national attention, Ramirez filed a lawsuit regarding his final moments on Earth. He requested that his pastor be present in the execution chamber to lay hands on him and pray aloud as the lethal injection was administered. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice initially refused, citing security protocols. Ramirez appealed, and the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 2022. Legal experts argued about the rights of death row inmates to exercise religious freedom in the final minutes of life. Supporters said the Constitution protects every individual's right to spiritual counsel, while detractors pointed out that Castro never got such a luxury. In a landmark decision, the court sided with Ramirez, affirming that states must reasonably accommodate these religious requests. On October 5, 2022, John Henry Ramirez walked into the execution chamber with his pastor close by. Rather than focusing on a lavish last meal, Ramirez used his final hours to pray and thank those who supported him. His official last meal request was modest. Some sources say he barely touched his food, appearing lost in thought or prayer. Witnesses who gathered, journalists, attorneys, and members of Castro's family watched with mixed emotions. The pastor placed a hand on Ramirez's shoulder, whispering words of prayer. The lethal injection followed. Ramirez's final statements included an apology to Castro's family, though they questioned its sincerity given the pain they endured for nearly 2 decades. As the drugs took hold, Ramirez's breath slowed. He managed a few words that sounded like a plea for forgiveness. Within minutes, the prison doctor pronounced him dead. Religious liberty advocates hailed the moment as a victory, evidence that even a condemned man retains certain constitutional protections. Castro's relatives, however, remained skeptical, feeling that spiritual comfort was a privilege their loved one never had. From chilling final meals to defiant last statements, these stories reveal how death row inmates confront the end in unsettling ways. Their final wishes can echo the cruelty of their crimes, or expose a desperate human need for control, forgiveness, or even a twisted sense of humor.